Central Regional Center for Rural Development. We're pleased to host this webinar on recreational homes, gateway communities, and rural change. And our presenters are here with us today. Dave Marcouiller from University of Wisconsin-Madison. Mark Skidmore is from Michigan State University. And Richelle Winkler is from Michigan Tech. And I think Dave will start, so go ahead, Dave.
Thank you, Scott, and good afternoon to those in the audience, and a hearty welcome from Madison, Wisconsin. It's sunny here. Rosa was complaining earlier that it was snowy in East Lansing, but we're experiencing a wonderful late winter day. I should start out by giving a shout out to the collaborators on this project. This is a 3-state project. We have people from the University of Minnesota, Dan Erkela, Bill Gartner, and Ann Zebarth. Here in Wisconsin, we have Steve Deller, Gary Green, and early on we had Kelly Haverkamp before she moved on. She was an extension educator up in Vilas County. Michigan State University, we have Mark Skidmore and Christine Vogt, and up at Michigan Tech in Houghton, Hancock, we have Richelle Winkler. I also want to just recognize the many graduate students that have helped on this, including Amanda Shiraka, Danya Kim, Ticha, Maria, Colette, and others. Without their wonderful support, we couldn't have gotten as far as we have gotten. In terms of objectives, what we're trying to do here is continue fairly lengthy 20-year history or so of work addressing recreational housing and the recreational home phenomenon. What we're trying to do is develop and bring up to date an applied research agenda, combining primary and secondary data, trying to work to develop outreach materials, and we just like one another. We like to collaborate with our neighbors on very similar community development issues in certain parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. In terms of where we're going with this 1-hour webinar, I'm going to provide a quick introduction on spatial attributes of recreational housing and report on some current work products and highlight interesting community development issues brought about by recreational housing. Then I'll turn it over to Mark Skidmore, who's going to be outlining some of the important land use and fiscal issues brought about by recreational homes. And then Richelle Winkler will provide a discussion of important demographic and social themes brought on by recreational housing and their homeowners. I'll then conclude by summarizing efforts and pointing to ongoing work to develop outreach materials for use by extension folks and others across the Lake States. And then we'll open it up for hopefully at least 15 minutes worth of questions with the audience. So that's where we're going. In terms of one of the first things that we started out with on this project was conducting a comprehensive literature review that included both peer-reviewed and gray or fugitive literature. This is an ongoing effort, and every time we think we get close to finishing, we find much more to add to it. Our search in the literature was global in scope. We found, in addition to U.S. and Canadian originating articles, we found similar research being done throughout Europe, especially Northern Europe, Great Britain, along the Mediterranean coast. Found a bunch of good work being done down in Australia and New Zealand, in Africa, especially South Africa and the rest of the southern portion of the African continent, and elsewhere. We had interests in this search in what others have been doing with respect to recreational housing, second homes, cottaging, a whole host of terms that we use to try to find this within the context of planning, development, land use, and resource management. We placed the relevant literature into cubby holes. You see them listed up here now. Development, land use, natural resource management. I should identify too that bottom title, that, let me see if I can do this here. There it is. This right here is the title of a manuscript that we have, and it's up on the website from the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development, which is I think it's at the bottom of your screen. On that archive, we have all of these manuscripts, and if you have interests, proceed to that. Again, the literature helps us understand the context of Lake State's rural change with respect to recreational housing. And from a global scope, I'm going to now proceed into finer and finer geographic scales. We're starting out here with the U.S. nationwide at the county level, and then I'll go to Lake State's minor civil division level data, and finally into case study regions at the minor civil division level and parcel level. What we show here On the screen now is the answer to where recreational housing exists. While definitions of what we're talking about are sometimes nebulous, we focused on the term recreational housing. Synonyms include cabins, cottages, second homes, vacation homes. Um, Seems like any term that's used has problems, but for our purposes, recreational housing is what we're going to stick with. In the U.S., the Census Bureau has a category of vacant during the March census date. Terminology there is known as vacant for seasonal, recreational, and occasional use, or SROU. Um, this is not without problems, and I'll just mention one right now. One key problem with this is that it becomes confounded with retirement migration. Once a person who owns an SROU retires, if they stay in the local area, that housing unit then becomes a permanent housing unit, so it gets out of that category. Anecdotal evidence suggests that this is a very important transition. We need to be a bit more specific in future work to try to get at that. This said, this SROU category of housing can be useful in understanding where the phenomenon of recreational housing exists. Nationwide in 2010, there were roughly 4.7 million SROU units, and they're not scattered homogeneously across the landscape, but they're found in places that we call recreation home regions or destination regions. With respect to rural development, these really stand out when we normalize the data relative to the total number of housing units, and that's shown here. Again, it's the same data. Now it's put on the basis of total number of housing units. And you can see pretty clearly that places in the lake states, here we go, places in the lake states, places in the Northeast, places in the West, Lake Tahoe, Florida, the Appalachian region. These are areas that have significant numbers of recreational homes relative to the total number of housing units. This becomes much more clear with respect to the lake states when we rank these by the top 25 U.S. counties by percent of total housing units classified by seasonal, recreational, occasional use. Several things are identified here. I just wanted to note that of the top 25 second home concentration counties, 10 of them exist within the lake states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Also interesting, not surprising though, that except for one of these top 25 counties, they're remote rural counties. They reflect non-adjacency to metropolitan area and smaller population sizes. Gets into some issues having to do with two terms, one called counter-urbanization, which is urban migration to rural areas beyond the commuter shed, versus exurbanization, which is urban migration to rural areas but within a commuter shed. It has to do with whether or not a person lives permanently in that area or whether or not it's a second home. Three lake states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan have roughly 12.5% of all seasonal, recreational, and occasional use units in the U.S. Again, not uniformly distributed, but tied to natural amenities. Most pronounced amenity type is water, and in particular, lake frontage. I'm going to go faster here since I know we're running short of time. This is a map at the minor civil division level that shows lake frontage and river frontage and mileage. These three states have roughly 60,000 miles of water frontage. I'm sorry, I got a little tickle. I'm going to just close it. I'm going to have to cough. Hold on. There I go. Now I'm back. Larger question here has to do with how saturated water resources are, or to restate this, how much more counter-urbanization pressure can we expect? Answers, again, are somewhat nebulous given escalating property values and the substitutability for other amenity types, but safe to suggest here that in some of these regions, our lakes are getting pretty full, pretty saturated.
Dave, can you explain the
It's
break
interesting.
there
You
at the
have a significant
Michigan
amount of public
Minnesota?
land that begins there. That's kind of where the Hiawatha National Forest starts into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And you see population densities drop off dramatically once you get past the Wisconsin-Michigan line. I don't know, Richelle, you're on the line. Maybe you can provide some further insights.
I think that you pretty much summed it up. That there's a lot of public land through that area, and they're just this map is showing numbers.
Right.
Sounds good.
Does that help, Scott? Okay. Let me just point out a couple of areas that are interesting here. I'm going to grab the central lower peninsula of Michigan. We've got the North Woods of Wisconsin. We've got Adams and Juneau County. These things stand out. We also have Lake Geneva down here. This is predominantly kind of a Chicago-influenced recreational housing region. Northwestern Wisconsin and into central Minnesota. This is the Brainerd Lakes area Richelle will be talking about in a bit. And this over here is the Otter Tail County kind of chain of lakes. So we do have some fairly significant densities of seasonal recreational occasional use housing. This one is on a per square mile basis, so this really pops out in areas that have high concentrations of second homes, seasonal homes. Again, the spatial issues are interesting, but what we're really interested in are developmental issues brought about by homeowners of second homes. Types of issues that we want to try to deal with here are economic development issues, private sector stimulus resulting from second homeowner spending, public service demands and fiscal issues, local government revenue and service needs. And some interesting distributional elements that Richelle will get to toward the end here, having to do with residential segregation, value appreciation, and local displacement of residents of these regions. It's getting to the point where it's very difficult for local residents of these recreational home regions to own land around lakes just simply because they've been priced out. Social change and community development focuses on demographic change. Again, something that Richelle will be dealing with in a moment, and social exclusion. There's a host of environmental and land use issues, some of which Mark will be dealing with in a moment. The direct impact on sensitive ecosystems is important, including things like recreational congestion as the pressure increases on these lakes. There's increased opportunities for recreational use conflicts. There's also large-scale invasive problems with Eurasian water milfoil and zebra mussel, to name a couple. Let me move forward here. We're getting kind of short on time. I did want to get, I'm just going to bounce ahead. We also have another manuscript that is available on the website that is titled Recreational Homes and Migration in Remote Amenity-Rich Regions. This focuses into a finer-grained analysis, a spatial analysis of in-migration, and we separated this out between rural remote and rural frontier. Less than 4 persons per square kilometer would be rural frontier. What we're trying to get at here are kind of the drivers behind in-migration to these regions with an interest in counter-urbanization taking place. In-migration rates, you see some of these areas have greater than 35% in-migration rates but in a 5-year period of time in the late 90s. Finally, getting down to our case studies, we've got 3 case studies identified. This exists as further research needs. We're trying to get to a point where we can conduct primary data collection using mixed methods approaches that include interviews and focus groups and Delphi processes. I'd just like to end this by identifying the 3 case studies that we've identified. The first is Big Sandy Lake. Up in Aiken County, Minnesota. Second one is up in Vilas County, Wisconsin. That's a 6-lake region around Armour Lake and Horsehead Lake. And the third case study is over in in Emmett County, Michigan, and Paradise Lake. We're collecting a bunch of data on at the parcel level that get at property owner characteristics and some fiscal taxation impacts. Again, though, it exists as further research. Just to tease you a little bit, these three exist with different origin destinations. When we look at the Aiken County case, most of this comes from the Twin Cities, right there. Big Sandy Lake is up here. Most of the people come from a 3-hour drive or so from the Twin Cities. In Vilas County, Wisconsin, the people who own property around, in this case study, are from the Chicago Metroplex and the Milwaukee-Madison area. Finally, Paradise Lake up in Emmett County, again, focusing on the urban refugee elements of counter-urbanization coming from Detroit and Lansing and what is this over here? Kalamazoo, kind of the southern portion of the peninsula. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Mark Skidmore, who will present information about the recreational area land use and property tax policies.
What I'd like
take it
to
away.
do in this section is just review some of the land use and property tax policies across the 3 states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, to give you a flavor of the differences and how it may matter to a property owner and how it may matter to whether or not you want to become a full-time homeowner or just a part-time homeowner. So let's do this. As Dave mentioned, some of our outputs for this research project have been some fact sheets. So there is a fact sheet that summarizes and provides more detail that we'll be putting out here soon. Okay, so we know that these areas are destination regions, but if you are thinking about buying property, I think it's very helpful and worthwhile to consider the land use policies, the property tax policies, because it does affect your bottom line and the cost of holding that property over time. And in particular, and with regard to land use policies, whether or not there are some safeguards in place to protect that, the quality of life and the property value over time. So let's quickly review the purpose of land use policies and then look at each of the states and summarize this as quickly as we can. Shoreland zoning environmental regulations, of course, are here not only to protect the health and safety and welfare of people, but also to protect the lakes and rivers from pollution. There are lots of different types of regulations that may be in place. For example, septic and sewer requirements, shoreland setbacks, limitations on fertilizer use around the lake or in the drainage basin, minimum lot sizes, and restrictions on vegetation removal around the lake. This picture here is a photo taken a number of years back in Delavan Lake, which is in southern Wisconsin, not far from Lake Geneva, that just had a lot of nutrient loading in the lake, and you can see the water quality is greatly diminished. As a result of the diminished quality of life around the lake, there was a $6 or $7 million project to rehabilitate the lake. So I was involved in a study on that. But this is an example and a reason for thinking about the importance of these kinds of zoning regulations. So some questions you might want to ask in your community or in a community that you're thinking about buying a property. Are appropriate regulations in place to protect water quality and indirectly your property value and quality of life if you want to make this an important part of your lifestyle, whether you're a part-time homeowner or full-time. Another important consideration is whether or not the property is a part of a lake association. You may not have a choice over this, and many lake associations have fees associated with them to pay for weed removal, educational, other kinds of things. So in addition to traditional property taxes, you may have additional fees as well. And that differs from lake to lake and area to area. In Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, there are differences in how the land use zoning around lakes are determined. In Michigan, zoning is determined at the local level. There is no overarching statewide, and so there's a lot of autonomy at the local level, a lot of differences from lake community to lake community. In fact, you could have two townships or a village and a township with different standards on land use and regulations. So you've got to be careful in looking at that. There isn't a sort of a general, you can't generalize Michigan very easily. In Minnesota, you do have statewide standards depending on the lake type. And there are three categories: natural environment, recreation development, and general development. And the standards qualify for the entire state. So it's a little easier to determine what the land use regulations are for lake properties or near lake properties. In Wisconsin, it's very similar to Minnesota. There are minimum statewide standards, and counties can't fall below that, but you could have additional standards as well, or more strict standards imposed at the county level. So that's a quick summary of land use policies. I think very important for preserving quality of life and preserving the natural amenities over time. And you want to pay attention to that as you think about the communities and the implications over time for property owners as well as the natural environment. For property owners, of course, property taxes are a very important financial consideration, and there are differences from community to community and state to state, and it has it's an important factor in determining the costs of holding the property, as well as determining whether or not you might want to be a part-time recreational homeowner or full-time and make that your full-time residence. There are three parts to property tax policies. One is the millage rate, as well as the definition of the tax base, which will reflect property value in some way, but there are substantial differences across the states in the definition of the tax base. And of course, whether or not there are property tax limitations in place to provide some guarantee that property taxes won't grow too quickly over time. In addition to that, every community offers a different set of services. So the question you might ask is, what services do I receive in return for those tax payments? Is my road plowed? Do I have garbage pickup? Do I want garbage pickup given I'm only there part-time? All of these are considerations as well. So let's focus on the millage and the tax base and the limitations and the differences across each of the states. In Michigan and Minnesota, the millages are higher for non-homestead properties, and so there are some benefits to potentially becoming a full-time resident in terms of a property tax millage reduction that you would receive in turn for becoming a full-time resident. Importantly, if you become a full-time resident, you may have you'll have voting rights, and you get to at least have some say in terms of local governance issues. If you're a part-timer, you don't have the same kind of influence that way, and certainly don't vote. In Michigan, the tax base is defined as taxable value, which is equal to about half of a market value at the time the property is purchased, but the laws state that your taxable value only grows at the rate of inflation for as long as you own the property. This is important because if you're thinking about using the current property owner's tax payment as a guide for how much tax you would pay, you're likely to be wrong, because they probably have owned that property for a long time. Lake property values have increased at a rate faster than inflation, and so it's very likely that your tax payment would be much higher than the previous owners or that of your neighbors. The good news about this is that it does guarantee that regardless of how fast your lake property values grow, that your taxes won't grow at that rate. It will only grow at the rate of inflation. There is also a revenue and expenditure growth limit in Michigan as well. In Minnesota, the tax base is again defined or based on market value, but it's equal to 1% of market value for the first $500,000 of value of that property, and then 1.5% value for any property valued over $500,000. So if it's $1 million property, you have your tax base defined as 1% of market value for the first 500, and then 1.5% for the second $500,000 of value. In Wisconsin, the millage is the same regardless of whether you're a homestead, that is a full-time resident, or a non-homestead property owner. The tax base is the market value, and there is an overall revenue growth, expenditure growth limit there. So that's a quick summary of the tax environment. Move forward here to the next slide. Again, in Michigan, this is just an overall estimate of the percentage of property taxes out of property value across the three states. And you can see this is taken here from the website listed below here. A little arrow here. By this average measure, Minnesota has the lower taxes on average. But again, it varies from community to community. It depends on the services and the tax base, the size of the tax base. And in Michigan, the tax payment depends on taxable value, which differs from person to person depending on the time that you bought the property and how fast the property values have grown. Well, we know that these policies are in place in varying degrees in all three states. The purpose of land use and property taxes and public services to protect quality of life, protect the natural environment, and importantly, there are financial implications. If these things are in place in the appropriate context, they preserve your property values and as well as the natural environment. And of course, property taxes are an important consideration when you're thinking about holding onto a property. The cost of holding the property differs considerably from state to state and community to community. Over here, I have just some resources for more detail on land use with regard to lake properties and recreational properties. Also, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy has detailed information on all property tax policies across the states, not just the three states that we reviewed here. So I think I got through my section in an appropriate amount of time, and I'm going to turn it over to Richelle.
Okay, thanks, Mark. And in this section, we're going to discuss demographics or population characteristics, and particularly focusing on counties that have a high proportion of seasonal or recreational homes. So this map is one that Dave showed you, and I just wanted to focus on it again because most of what I'm going to cover focuses on those counties that have 10% or more of all housing units for seasonal, recreational, or occasional use. So these are the counties that are not white on this map. There are 549 of them that fit this definition, and I'll refer to them for the rest of this presentation as recreational housing counties. And I want to spend a moment with this question of who are the demographics that I'm about to present about. Most of the data that we get about populations in specific geographic locations, especially in more rural areas, come from the U.S. Census. And these data do not include seasonal residents, so it's important to point that out, that the demographic data I'm going to show you today are not including the seasonal residents themselves. The census specifically counts people based on their usual place of residence, is how they classify that. So for the most part, this does not include people who own and visit seasonal recreational homes, but it would include the permanent residents of these places. So what does this mean for the data that I'm about to show you? Well, it means that the data are about the permanent population, not the seasonal, but it's important still we can think about the presence of seasonal homes in these places as changing the permanent resident population structure. And I think you'll see what I mean as we as we move through this. So a big way that seasonal housing affects permanent populations is through the migration process. People oftentimes move permanently into a home that was once only for seasonal or recreational use, as Dave mentioned, and sometimes they even purchase a home for seasonal use with the idea that they're eventually going to retire there. So migration is a big factor in shaping the population composition of the permanent resident population in these kind of places. So for this reason, this slide and the next few that I'm about to show you focus on migration. More specifically, they show net migration, or the net result of the number of in-migrants minus the number of out-migrants. And they do this by age. So what you're looking at here along the horizontal axis is the age, with the youngest ages on the left. And so I thought I was grabbing, there I got the arrow now, I think. Yeah, so the youngest ages here on the left and the oldest ages at the right. Everything above this black center line represents positive net in-migration, or a gain due to net migration. Everything below this line represents net out-migration, or population loss due to migration. The different colored lines represent change over time, with the lighter colors representing earlier time periods. So this lightest yellow is the 1950s, and the darker color representing more recent decades up to the 2000 to 2010 time period. So this chart shows the average age-specific net migration patterns for recreational housing counties, those with 10% or more of all housing units being seasonal. And you can see that in the 1950s, there was net out-migration in these counties at every age. In the 1960s, they started to experience some positive in-migration in the retirement years. And the 1970s were really boom years for these counties and for much of rural America. They had net in-migration at almost every age, except for young adults still experienced net out-migration. In the 1990s and the 2000s, the strongest positive in-migration has really been among these of retirement age, with about 20 to 30% of the population being net in-migrants at these ages. So these next few charts show, it's essentially the same chart, but it shows those case studies that Dave introduced. So here we have Aiken County, Minnesota. You can see that the patterns here are similar to those experienced for rec housing counties on average, without migration of young adults. And it's actually about 40% of all 20 to 29-year-olds leaving the county. There's some in-migration among families with children, and then the most net in-migration at the retirement years. You might also notice that the scale here has changed on the left in comparison to the average for the seasonal or the recreational housing counties I showed previously. So these patterns here in Aiken County are a little bit more pronounced than they were in the last slide in comparison to the average. If we look at Vilas County, one of the other case sites, it also follows the same pattern, but the migration among retirees began a little bit sooner here in Vilas County, and it also peaked sooner and has leveled off a little bit in recent years in Vilas County. And then finally in Emmett County, the third case, again follows the same pattern, but these are not as strong, and retirement migration is not as overwhelming in Emmett County as it is in the other cases. So Emmett County actually is a little bit more similar to the average for recreational housing counties, with retirement migration not playing quite as big of a role, and actually less out migration of young adults. So you might be wondering how these recreational housing counties compare to other non-metro counties. This chart shows the rec housing counties in shades of green or blue, and all other non-metro counties in shades of orange and red for the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. So just these last 3 decades. And you can see that all of these counties, both the recreational housing ones and all other non-metros, experience net out-migration of young adults. On average, 10 to 20% of young adults move out of these counties. But the recreational housing counties experience more positive net in-migration at all of the other ages, and especially among retirees. So we can see how these migration patterns affect population distribution by now comparing population characteristics in the recreational housing counties to those in all non-metropolitan counties. And that's what I'm going to do on these next few slides. So the recreational housing counties on average have smaller populations than non-metro counties as a whole, but their populations grew faster between 2000 and 2010 than what non-metropolitan counties as a whole did. And this more rapid population growth is primarily due to net migration, as we saw on the previous slides. Looking at race ethnicity, the proportion of the population who are non-Hispanic white is declining in both the recreational housing counties and also in all non-metropolitan counties as the minority population grows, and this is something that's happening across the U.S. But a higher proportion of the population in the rec housing counties is non-Hispanic white. These are whiter areas than non-metropolitan America as a whole, and that proportion, non-Hispanic white, is declining at a slower rate than it is in some other types of non-metro counties. And looking at age, it's important to point out that non-metropolitan America as a whole is older than metropolitan America, and it's aging faster. When we look at the recreational home counties, they're older than non-metropolitan counties as a whole, and they are also aging faster. So for instance, between 2000 and 2010, the median age in recreational housing counties increased from about 40 years to over 44 years. So it increased by more than 4 years. And what this means is that in 2000, over half of the population is over age 44 in the average recreational housing county. So that's what median age means. The population in all non-metro counties grew older as well over the decade, but it increased more slowly by about 2.5 years. So what's driving the aging of the population? I would encourage you to think back to those slides that I just showed. Some of the aging is certainly due to the general population aging. We hear a lot across the U.S. and the more developed world about population aging, and this is a general phenomenon going on due to declining fertility rates and the aging of the baby boom generation. So some of this aging is due to that aging in place, or simply natural progression. But a big part of this, especially when we look at non-metropolitan areas and recreational housing counties specifically, is due to migration patterns, the out-migration of young adults and the in-migration of retirees, both of those things happening simultaneously. So when we think about demographics, we often consider socioeconomic characteristics such as educational attainment, poverty, employment patterns, and housing. I want to spend some time now comparing these kinds of socioeconomic characteristics in the recreational housing counties to all non-metro counties. And I should note that for the next several slides, the data are from Census 2000, so they're getting a little bit older now, but there isn't a directly comparable measure for more recent time periods because of the shift to the American Community Survey, which has some really interesting implications in these seasonal recreational home counties. So if you have questions about that, I'm happy to address it later. But in these slides, data for the recreational housing counties is shown in green, and for all non-metro counties is shown in purple. You can see from this slide that educational attainment is higher in recreational counties, with about 16% of all adults aged 25 and older achieving a 4-year college degree. And as of Census 2000, we can see from this slide that recreational housing counties had lower poverty and near poverty, which is measured as an income of less than 2 times the poverty rate. Unemployment is about the same in recreational housing counties compared to other non-metros. And there's more of the population that's employed only seasonally and a higher percent that's employed in the tourism industry. Looking at median housing value, these values for owner-occupied housing units, and again, seasonal housing units are not included here. They're considerably higher in recreational housing counties than the average non-metro. And these may seem low, like low values, but again, remember that these are from 2000, so there's been considerable inflation since that time. But this difference here is due partly to the demand for housing units being driven through migration into these recreational housing counties, but also due to the fact that seasonal residents and seasonal housing does place demand on the housing market, even though they're not counted in these owner-occupied housing values. So in fact, actually, one of the biggest problems with recreational housing development is the potential for problems associated with housing affordability. And this slide begins to illustrate how that might happen. So far, everything that we've discussed is really focused on the demographics of the permanent residents in recreational housing counties. But how are these seasonal residents different? Survey data from multiple case sites indicates that seasonal residents usually are more highly educated and wealthier, and so there is some real interest and concern about how recreational housing development might contribute to inequality and cultural conflict. But the distinctions between what counts as a seasonal or permanent resident are blurry. Seasonals spend varying amounts of time in their second home. Some may stay, for a 1 weekend a year. Others may spend 4 or 5 months or come every weekend of the year. And the attachment to place varies considerably within the seasonal population and also within the permanent group. So survey data from multiple studies actually indicate that seasonal and permanent residents are generally more alike than most people think. And much of this is due to the fact that these seasonal residents often become permanent residents when they retire. So where to draw that distinction is fuzzy, and sort of who counts as what. I dealt with this issue in a study that I did in Crow Wing County, Minnesota. This was a case study, and I did it by focusing not on classifying individual people as seasonal or permanent and looking at how they affect inequality, but instead on looking at geographic differences within the county on those smaller geographic areas that have lakes and seasonal residents compared to those areas that don't. So it's not so much about differences between seasonal and permanent residents, but instead about the differences between the destination communities or the specific lakes areas and the more traditional communities and the populations in them. So Crow Wing County is an interesting case to look at because it has a large number of seasonal housing units, over 10,000, and about 30% of all the housing units in the county are for seasonal or recreational use. This is known as the Brainerd Lakes area. For those of you who might have heard it called that, and it's just west of Aiken County, which is one of those case sites that I talked about earlier and that Dave talked about. So on the aggregate, Crow Wing County experienced dramatic population and economic growth in the 1990s and the early 2000s. It was Minnesota's fastest growing non-metropolitan county between 1990 and 2008, with the population increasing by 41%, and the median household income doubled between 1999 and 2008 from about $23,000 to $46,000. But despite the considerable aggregate population and economic growth, the Brainerd Lakes area has some severe economic problems. The city of Brainerd, which is the largest population center in the region, had in 2010 the highest unemployment rate of any city in Minnesota, which was about 19%. And this quote that you see on the slide is from a Brainerd newspaper headline from 2010, and it demonstrates the difference between the city and the rest of the county. And the outside the city part of the county, much of that is made up of lake home destination areas. So it suggests that there's some real inequality going on between different smaller communities within the county, and that when examining the impact of something like recreational housing development, it's important to look more closely than simply the aggregate county level measures of well-being. So to get into the details about the differences between the haves and the have-nots in Crow Wing County, I divided the minor civil divisions, these are the MCDs, the cities, villages, and rural townships, into three types. The historic city centers, these are like Brainerd and Crosby, where the populations were historically clustered. Lake districts, and these are municipalities that have large lakes and several seasonal homes. And then rural townships, and these are other rural areas. They're mostly forested and quite rural. They don't have large lakes, but many of them are located near the lakes. So this chart shows differences between these lake districts, city centers, and rural towns. In the lake districts, on average, more than 50% of all housing units were for seasonal or recreational use. Very few seasonal homes in the historic city centers. I don't show income in this chart here because it would need a different scale, but I found that household incomes and housing values are considerably higher in the lakes districts, with housing values being more than twice as high in the lakes districts compared to the city centers, and median household incomes being almost twice as high. But several indicators of socioeconomic status, the high status indicators show much higher educational attainment, for instance, in the lake districts compared to the historic city centers. And then some of the indicators of low socioeconomic status, like rental housing and poverty, had dramatically higher rates in the historic city centers compared to the lakes districts and the rural townships. So what this does is suggest that inequality is an issue to be concerned about, but that it may not be most important to look at in terms of the differences between seasonal and permanent, but rather in terms of the uneven development of geography. And it suggests that the recreational housing development may not necessarily be this kind of rising tide that lifts all boats, but rather that poverty and unemployment continue. They just might be concentrated into specific geographic locations and washed out in the aggregate county level statistics by the in-migrants who come and the increase in income that they bring. So to summarize what's going on in Crow Wing County case, in the past the population was clustered in these small city centers, but over the last 30 years or so, new housing development has almost entirely been in the lakes areas or in the more rural townships. As the population has dispersed and the stock of newer and nicer housing has moved to the countryside and the lakes communities. It's a measure of success to live on the lake for amenity migrants, seasonal homeowners, and even for local people too. People with money and status live on the lakes and not in town, and the middle class is increasingly living in more rural areas outside of town if they can't afford lake property. So one of the byproducts of recreational housing development in rural areas is that it can segregate counties by socioeconomic status so that people who can afford to live near the source of the amenities, in the upper Midwest this is mostly the lakes, while lower income people and younger people too become increasingly concentrated in the small city centers. Because most of the more affluent people are older, this process ends up segregating the area by age as well as income. So the younger people are concentrated in the small city centers. in this context, we don't think about poverty as much because it's hidden and it's often ignored by the more well-to-do residents. And as one of the participants in this study put it, it's hard to realize that there's poverty here when you're surrounded by million-dollar homes. You're in Baxter or on the lakes where everything's shiny, and you never go to downtown Brainerd where everything's falling apart. So just to finish up, in the end, the research consistently suggests that the seasonal and recreational housing changes local demographics primarily through migration. This causes population aging, increasing levels of educational attainment, and an increase in the amount of income in the local area that in-migrants and seasonal residents bring. It also tends to increase housing values and can potentially pose challenges for affordable housing. And then it can also contribute to uneven development, with focus really getting paid to particular amenity-rich areas or lakes areas while others are not invested in. And this can shift the power structure and influence from what have been the more historic communities to the lakes communities. And I think Dave was going to finish up with a slide here.
All right. Thanks, Richelle. You know, a couple of takeaways from this very interesting information. First of all, further research is needed. Lots of further research. Second, geographic scale matters. Richelle pointed out the differences at the sub-county level that often are glossed over at the county level. And we have a couple of manuscripts here that look at secondary data. One looks at the secondary data at the county level, that's this one, and one that looks at secondary data at the minor civil division level. And I'll just kind of reflect a little bit of what Richelle had indicated. It's important to remember that the data representing second home regions often reflects residents and not the non-residents or the seasonal, recreational, occasional use homeowners. The county level data can suggest that higher recreational housing concentrations are associated with lower levels of economic characteristics, such as lower levels of per capita income, higher poverty rates, higher rents, higher unemployment rates, but lower levels of income inequality. As you get finer and finer in terms of geographic scale, these things become more evident, right? The income inequality actually decreases at the finer scales, right? As you get the residential segregation taking place around lakes, everyone's wealthy compared to in the communities where income inequality might be relatively equal, but everybody's much poorer. So geographic scale really matters. Scott, if I could get you to bring on now the fact sheets. Can you pull those into the, there we go. Are they up now in front of people? We have 3 fact sheets that we've been working on in terms of outreach materials. The one that's up now is the demographics of recreation housing, and this goes through some of the things that Richelle went through. We also have an overview fact sheet that goes through some of the locational elements associated with recreational homes, and the material that Mark presented on land use, that's in another fact sheet. And at this point, can I move that? I can't move that. Can we move that away so I can see the underlying title? I think it's called Land Use and Land Use and Property Taxes for Recreational Housing in the Great Lakes region. So these are works in progress. We'll continue to conduct applied research and develop outreach materials over the course of the next 6 months to a year. The ones that are listed on this page are found on the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development web archive. And Rosa will be, if they're not there quite yet, Rosa will be putting them up after this is done. And with that,
well, thanks for a quick tour over a really comprehensive set of materials that the team has developed here, and I think folks can get on and check out some of those things. Feel free to put questions in the chat box. We have an evaluation here that people should be able to fill out online. So go ahead and do that as we're waiting for questions. One question that I had earlier, and then as you were talking, it seemed you might be revealing some other reasons for that that sharp drop off on the Wisconsin-Michigan border up in the UP. It could be true that the state lands on the Michigan side hamper recreational home development, but another reason might be you start thinking about if you cross a state line, all of a sudden you've got a different set of institutional rules around how you use that property. So if you're in Wisconsin and you're buying a second house somewhere else in Wisconsin, you at least are aware of rule changes that come up, and more aware of what property taxes are doing and things like that. And you cross that state line, you've got this other set of regulations that come into play. Same thing with if you want to hunt or fish, the rules might be slightly different. So there might be some of that going on where people are just a little bit reluctant to, kind of learn another set of institutions and rules. And I noticed that a little bit when you showed the map of the where people were coming from. So, northern Michigan, it was mostly metropolitan Detroit. Northern Wisconsin, it was mostly metropolitan areas in Wisconsin, and then maybe a little bit in Chicago too. And then so then those Chicago people would be going 2 states away, wouldn't they? And then also in Minnesota, not crossing the state line. So yeah, so that might be part of it is just unfamiliarity with the institutions on the other side of the line, and maybe unwillingness to learn about them. And it does say something for those kind of state marketing plans, right? If you're trying to market the state, there might be some things to talk about there in terms of trying to harmonize across, like DNRs and things. But anyway, in reactions to that?
I travel fairly regularly in the winter to go up to the Porcupine Mountains from Madison, and I go through Boulder Junction, Presque Isle, and then into Marinesco in the UP. And I tell you, it is night and day going from Wisconsin to Michigan. And part of that I think has to do with the location of the USDA Forest Service land, but there are also these institutional issues, and the tax rules and the incentives for long-term ownership in Michigan that we don't have as much of in Wisconsin. So I guess I just responded, yes, there probably are some institutional issues there, but it's really night and day when you go from Wisconsin to Michigan in the UP. UP is kind of an odd. The UP is an animal.
And Zebra had a question.
Yeah, I saw that Anne had a question about that, and I think I can speak to that. The probably most comprehensive answer is no. There have been some surveys done out there in different case sites looking into those questions, and I think that from what I have seen, there's a body of literature that suggests that seasonal residents are very interested in environmental improvements. In terms of differences in funding priorities, I would again suggest that this is probably more a distinction, not necessarily a seasonal versus permanent distinction, but sort of the amenity community and an age-based community in comparison to maybe the more historic populations, city centers, younger people. So in the work that I did in Crow Wing County, for instance, I found that the segregation in terms of geography by both age and income did affect people's interests and support for the schools, for instance. Actually, it really, the wealthier, older people who lived in the lakes communities were very interested in cultural arts opportunities, environmental issues, and also healthcare issues, especially some of the more comprehensive advanced healthcare issues. And so they were very active and put a lot of volunteer hours and monetary donations into those kinds of activities, but really were reluctant to support things like public education, affordable housing, and reproductive health care actually was something that really struggled in this area. So I think seeing some of that power balance in that sense, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a seasonal permanent distinction because of the number of retirees that you end up having in these places who are permanent residents.
Looks like another Richelle question. Yeah, Richelle question there about what happens to the, if people are sort of pushed out from the lake area, do they just relocate somewhere else, or do they go?
Well, I can really only answer that with data in terms of the case study work that I did in Crow Wing County, but I wouldn't say it's so much people getting pushed out of the lakes areas. Most of what's happening in the lakes areas is new development on land that was very sparsely populated. And so I think it's more about sort of the lower income population getting more increasingly concentrated in the historic city centers that have always had housing, sort of these older units, and the investment has really happened outside of those places, out on the lakes or out near the rivers or the other amenities, whereas there's been little investment in a lot of the towns, as anybody with the means to do so wants to sort of get out on the amenity, and that's sort of where things are happening and going on. So that's sort of the way that things segregate more than people actually getting priced off. It's sort of that the new development is happening in the more amenity areas.
And then Ann had a comment that you should be in touch with her if you're interested in housing affordability issues. One thing that surprised me a little bit in the data was the failure of people to sort of out-migrate or the new arrivals. It wasn't surprising to me that the 60-some people were migrating to these areas. It was a little surprising to see that they maybe, when they're getting maybe a decade older, a little more feeble, a little more interested in higher level of health care, or maybe need to be closer to their offspring, that they're not sort of remigrating to somewhere else. It seemed like there was
we don't see a huge mass exodus. We do see sort of stopping of the in-migration at those older ages. I'd say 75 plus, it really drops off and there's slight net out migration. But, a lot of these more amenity destination areas have really focused on being able to maintain the older population. So, a lot of the hospitals, for instance, and businesses have come up with, condo living situations and progressive housing type situations, some even directly attached to hospitals that are very nice on the lake and beautiful locations to try to keep those people there.
And Ann Seabarth made a comment too that she's observing that they do stay. So, and that there's some impacts on the healthcare system. And she also wanted to know about property taxes affecting the lower income homeowners in town. So I think that's a Mark question.
This is Mark. I think there are a couple of layers that could happen, and it might differ from state to state. In some cases, for example, in Wisconsin, where you have a general revenue expenditure growth limit, if property values on the lake increase more rapidly than the town in town, then really the proportion of taxes being paid shifts over to the lake property owners, and it's even possible that the tax payment on properties in town would actually fall a little bit. So that just has to do with the differential in growth of property values of lake properties and non-lake properties, and in combination with revenue and expenditure growth limits. In Michigan, as long as you don't move, right, you're protected with the taxable value cap, so that your tax payment in your taxable value only grows at the rate of inflation, unless for some reason the millages increase, but that only happens by referenda, maybe not quite so often. It's not clear. I mean, if you're a lower income person on a lake in Minnesota or Wisconsin, you could find yourself paying much higher taxes over time, and that could create pressures, but probably not in the towns, in the nearby towns.
Okay, well, if folks want to input a couple more questions, if folks can stay on, we have run past our time, but if our presenters can stay on a couple more minutes, we can see if there's another question or two. I saw somebody typing. Just Dan thanking everyone. So it sounds like we're through the questions, and I want to thank everybody for a nice job covering a large set of material, and I do invite folks to go onto the website and look at some of these articles that the team has provided.
Hey, Scott, thank you very much, and thank Rosa for